Welcome back, everybody. Today I wanted to take a look at the idea of the art of modernism. And the just to kind of give you some context, the term modernism has some ambiguous connotations to it. Sometimes it's referred to as anything after the Middle Ages, where anything from the Renaissance on, they consider that to be modernism. And the reason for that is that it changes the way that we see ourselves and our relationship to the universe. And it really advances, right? The emphasis on scientific advancements becomes part of that. Another use of the term modernism is in place of contemporary. So sometimes people say, "Oh, this is modern," meaning that it's more contemporary. And those are valid uses of the term, but sometimes it gets a little bit unclear as to what modernism we're referring to. So I just wanted to define the modernism that we're going to be addressing today. That the term modern art or art of modernism that we're going to be examining is art from about 1865 with the development of Impressionism until about roughly after World War II. And so that's generally within the art world. They say when they talk about modernism, that's what they tend to be referring to is that it's a movement, it's a way of seeing art, it's a way of representing the human experience. And two works of art that are representative that we'll kind of come back to and think about more is Henri Matisse's The Open Window and Rene Magritte's The Human Condition. And as we think about ways of reflecting and expressing the human experience. And I had you read a couple of articles that talked about modernism. I had you in its movement towards modernism in week two when we were taking a look at beauty. I had you read Stephen Hicks's Why Art Became Ugly, and I also had you watch a video by Robert Florzak, and he has his own kind of interpretation of what happened. And I just wanted to provide more context to how art is doing this and what art is responding to, and so why it's moving towards abstraction. Some of these major ideas, and we've been taking a look at World War II and some of the philosophical changes with Freud and Nietzsche and Darwin, and so art is going to start reflecting this, and so it's going to give us kind of this overview of the human condition. And one quote that I wanted to address comes from a professor on campus, a professor of music, Brother Kerr. And he gave this quote at a devotional a little while back, and he talks about this idea of modernism. And the modernism that he's going to refer to is a similar use of the term, but he's going to be focusing on modernism within music. And then I'm going to see if we can kind of find some parallels between similar themes within art, within the visual arts. He says, one of the classes that I teach examines the theory behind 20th and 21st century music. There is always resistance at the beginning of the semester to the music as it is introduced because it sounds so weird. In the minds of students, because the music is not organized around the major and minor tonal system so familiar to us, it is considered not worthy of study, or worse, it is branded somehow evil. But once students understand the theory behind the music, the way it is constructed, the music suddenly makes sense and becomes listenable, sometimes even enjoyable. Seeking learning with an open, eager mind enables learning and enables the Holy Ghost to direct and validate that which we learn. And part of the what he expresses within this quote is that when people initially see modern or hear modern music, they say it sounds weird. And similarly, when people see modern art, they say it looks weird, right? Where modern music is questioning the ideas of tonality, modern art is questioning the ideas of representation, right? And generally, when I introduce this, people say it looks weird because it's not visually appealing, or it's not visually the way that we see the world. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that. As we go forward, I wanted to start with an activity. I'm going to show you some artworks throughout, from the Renaissance on, and I want you to think about what commonalities do they have? There's going to be a common motif within them that I want you to notice. This one we've seen before. We talked about this one when we talked about beauty in week two, Gerliandio's the old man and a young boy. We talked about his nose and the beauty, right, that's represented within the work. Here's another one, Robert Campin's the workshop. What we have here is Mary, kind of off aloof, how she's often represented, kind of reading, studying the scriptures, and then Angel Gabriel comes in and announces that she's going to be the mother of Jesus. Over on the right-hand side, you have Joseph in his workshop as a carpenter. And then over here, these would be the patrons, the ones that were paying for the art. Because they're paying for the art, I guess they get to kind of open up the door and have a window into this kind of divine, religious, kind of sacred event. And so here we see this one most of you are probably familiar with, Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, where we see Christ at the very center. He's flanked on both sides by his apostles, right? Six on one side, six on the other. And this is the moment that he's telling them that one of them is going to betray him, right? So there's some outrage, there's some expressing of concern or some debate about that during this particular scene. Here's one, just some, fruit. I don't, quince, cabbage, melon, and a cucumber that's being represented here. It's kind of interesting as you go through art museums and taking a look at older art of, the 17th century. They did paint a lot of fruit, how fruit and vegetables have evolved over the years. That's just kind of a side note. Here's Vermeer. We've seen Vermeer before. Similar kind of image that we've seen before. Woman with a water jug. Again, thinking about what is this? How is this connecting with Ghirlandaio's The Old Man and the Boy, or Da Vinci's The Last Supper, or the Annunciation. Here we see a fun one. This one's just blowing soap bubbles. Young woman drawing, right? So as we think about these works, I want you to think about what do they have in common, and I'll kind of flip back through them. I'll go backwards and I'll kind of come forwards, and so just kind of think about, what do you notice that's similar? What do they all have? What do they all share? Right? Commonalities. Right, and I'm going to go through them one more time just to give you kind of a last look at what this could be, right? Where is Osted going with this? All right, thinking about this, each of them all share a window, right? So the question that I want you to think about is how did we get from here, right, with this woman looking out the window, kind of a realistic painting, to this Matisse, which doesn't look that realistic. And I want you to think about art as a window into the world in which it was created, right? It's a window to see how they were living life, what they valued, some of the stories that they told that were important to them. But it's also a window into the mind and heart of the artist, right? As the artist is choosing what to emphasize, what to represent, how to represent it. And the third window of art is the window of ourselves, right? The window of the viewer. That we, as we interpret art, as we experience art, it's revealing what is important to us, because certain things are going to stand out to one person that might not stand out to someone else. And so art is going to depend upon what we bring to it. And so in this way, it's kind of this threefold window into the world around us, into the human condition. And so it's something to think about as a way to consider art and art appreciation. Clement Greenberg was a very prominent art critic of the 20th century. He was mainly championing modern art after World War II. And he kind of summarizes some of the transitions that we see that happening within modernism as an art kind of movement in general. He says where the old masters, think, of the Renaissance, created an illusion of space into which one could imagine walking, the illusion created by a modernist is one into which one can travel through only with the eye, right? So it's a different kind of mindset. It's a different type of representation that's being focused on, right? Where the Renaissance and after up into to Romanticism, what they're mainly focusing on is trying to represent the real world, right? To give the sense that the viewer can enter into this space, right? This actual real space that reflects the real world, right? Visually. But what we see within the modern artist is a different kind of reflection, a different type of space that people are walking, right? Walking into the minds of the interpretation of the artist, as we see with Van Gogh, right? He's not representing the actual world. He's inviting us into how he sees, interprets the actual world. And so here we see that the focus of ancient and Renaissance space within art, and the focus is how do we see, right? So we have the artist standing here and then looking, and then it's going to represent this exterior world and trying to represent that as realistically as possible. So uses these lines in order to convey lines and the illusion of depth on the canvas through these what are known as orthogonal lines. What we see within the modern artist is the focus is not necessarily on the illusion of space, it's more focusing on a different type of reality, right? So there's focusing on reality, right? The visual, the ocular reality. They're focusing more on the reality of the world around them, right? So just to kind of think about this, right? As we think about Magritte's human condition, some of you have already noticed the inside joke that he represents here with the window, and then we kind of see out the window, and then we realize that this is an easel here, and then we start to think, oh, wait, this is an easel in front of the window. Isn't that kind of funny? And then this quote kind of summarizes that joke. It says, we read space, but we know that the painting on the easel is flat, right? Then we remember that the whole painting itself is also flat. What is real? Plain illusion implies that the painting is less real than the landscape, when in fact both are painted fictions. And so, as we think about the difference between Renaissance space and modernist space, what Renaissance space is trying to do is create the illusion of space to create a sense of reality. What we see within modernism is they're not necessarily trying to convey the illusion of space. They believe that reality is not trying to create some type of fiction, but is to represent the reality of the mind, the reality of that art is in itself an illusion, as we see here with Magritte, right? They're actually trying to represent reality rather than the illusion of reality, right? So Magritte's joke here is we tend to think, oh, this is a representation of reality, right, with a window, and then he kind of makes us aware that, wait, no, this isn't a representation. This isn't reality. This is just a representation. This is a flat surface, right? And it's interesting that he titles this one the human condition, right? As we're constantly seeking for truth and seeking for reality, then the question becomes, well, what really is truth? And what really is reality. And that's a big part of what we're going to be examining this semester as we think about decoding propaganda, the propaganda that surround us. I wanted to just give you an overview of some of the major art movements up until World War I that will flesh out some of the ideas that we've been talking about to focus on this movement from representational art towards abstraction. And so each of these are art movements that are some type of they're creating a narrative along the spectrum towards abstraction. And it's an interesting story that's being told. We're not going to take a look at all of these art movements. If you want to take a look at them in more detail, I recommend that you take Art 202 or Humanities 202. It's actually a fascinating journey, and it's actually really fun to take a look at. Let's take a look at realism. I wanted to give you some of the values of realism for your notes, for your understanding. Realism was an art and literary movement that began around 1850. It was a reaction against Romanticism. Those of you that know some elements of Romanticism, would be the works of Caspar David Friedrich, which painted like huge kind of landscapes, or it would be the works of, in literature, it would be the works of like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or with British, Romantic poets. You see that would be with Keats and Wordsworth. but focusing on more kind of sensationalism and kind of the big themes of life. But this is a reactionist. Rather than focusing on overly emotional or exaggerated elements, realism focuses more on the importance of day-to-day events, right? Rather than kind of extreme events, they're trying to find kind of the romantic qualities, the hope, the love, the passion within day-to-day events. Realists stress the common people in doing common things, ordinary situations, to find the truths that are embedded all around us in these everyday occurrences. Its art focuses more on a social commentary that the modern industrial world is negatively affecting the poorest of the people. Mainly, it tends to use darker earth tones like browns and darker, kind of blues and blacks, as we see with Malays, the sower, to focus more on the kind of the darker themes within life, to suggest that life is a conflict, it's a struggle for survival in the modern world. And so, in a similar way that we see with Darwin, that life is a struggle for survival. Here we see with the sower as someone going out to sow seeds, right? And so it's a common person, it's a farmer just kind of going out working with his hands. This isn't about someone that's, a politician or a wealthy businessman. This is a common, the poorest of the among people, but it's the people that's feeding the rest of the world. He's going out and he's kind of casting his seeds to into the soil, working with his hands, working with nature. But then it's also a bit of a struggle because right behind him, you have these birds that are flocking to eat the seeds that he has just cast in the ground. And so, again, this is this struggle for survival, a struggle for existence as we move, kind of towards industrialization, urbanization. This one, Malays the Gleaners, represents a similar aspect of this. Here we see kind of the poorest, the poor, that the most kind of the most vulnerable are going to be the poorest, and particularly the women. And what we see here are the gleaners. A gleaner is someone that will go in and pick up the remnants of something, right? Whatever the case may be, right? So it would be someone that would go in and pick up the things that would be kind of left over that are unwanted. And so some students they can, yeah, I guess, be considered gleaners as they travel around the streets and look for all the discarded furniture to decorate their dorms or their apartments with that. That would be kind of a gleaner, right? So what we see with the gleaners here are these women that are going into the field after the harvest, right? So these are the harvesters. These are the people that are kind of collecting the wheat and the grain and going off to now the mill to get that taken care of. And then the women come into the field after the harvesters and they pick up the grains that are left behind. And so they're going back to feed their families with the things that these people didn't even find were worthy enough for them to bend over and pick up. And so these are the poorest, the poor, working, toiling, right? They're kind of bent over in these kind of huddled postures, back-breaking hard work, and these are the people that we tend to forget. And so realism is trying to cast a spotlight on common people doing common things, right? This isn't necessarily anything necessarily in and of itself romantic, but the romanticism is within that struggle for survival, right? That becomes the beauty of existence. And so we see that element reflected within his gleaners. Taking a look at Impressionism. Impressionism is a reaction to realism, right? Realism is focusing on, trying to convey how the eye sees, right? So these are still very realistic images. We can see, the hands and the feet and the hair and the dresses, right? We can see everything kind of very realistic. Impressionism is somewhat different from this. This is an art movement that began around 1865, 1870s, right? Impressionists were very distraught and angry that the art salons in Paris rejected over 3,000 works in one year, that the salons, the art salons in Paris were becoming too exclusive. And at the time, if you wanted to be a successful artist, if you actually wanted to sell your work, you'd have to get it into what was known as a salon, which would be kind of like an art show. and the art show would then put its stamp of approval on it, and then people would go, and then because it was sold in a salon, that meant that the art had legitimacy, and that way people would buy it, right? And so then that was considered valuable. But if it's being rejected, that means no one's going to buy your art because it doesn't have that seal of approval on it. And so Impressionists were taking a look at how it kind of exclusive and how regimented the salons were becoming. And so you had a group of artists that said, hey, let's just put on our own art show, right? And so they put on their own art show, and at first they were kind of mocked and laughed at because they were doing something different and weird, and they weren't part of the salons, right? So they were rejecting the norm. But then they became ultra famous, right? Monet is, ultra famous, and it became known as Impressionism because this was the work of art that was exhibited in one of the first shows in 1872. So you can see Claude Monet signing it down here. 1872 is the date. But what the focus of Impressionism is trying to capture the immediacy of the modern world. And as the world civilization starts to modernize quickly and change quickly, art starts to reflect that. And so what Monet and other Impressionists are seeking to do is to try to capture that changing world as fast as they can. And so I think in the modern, contemporary mindset, see, I'm using the term modern in lieu of contemporary as well. But in the contemporary sense, I think we can think about Impressionism as being kind of like a Polaroid, right? Something that you can just quickly take and then you can have to keep. And so what you see with Impressionism is they're trying to paint hastily rather than carefully crafted brushstrokes, right? We see kind of quickly sketched brushstrokes, and the idea for Impressionism is to try to capture it as quickly as possible because one of the focuses is on how light changes a work of art, right? Is the impression sunrise. This sunrise isn't going to stay. The sun's not going to stay in the same spot forever, and so Monet has to capture it quickly, right? Another part of Impressionism is, in addition to studying light, they're studying how the eye sees. Because if you take a look at each individual one of these work, each one individual brushstroke, what you'll notice is it's just a glob of paint on the canvas, right? This is just a glob of paint. But as we take a look a little bit about the context of it, right, we'd say, okay, there's an orange blob here surrounded by this kind of bluish gray mass, and then there's some kind of more yellow and orange and a little bit of red up here, and then there's this kind of dark image here, and then a bit of orange. We start to say, oh, that must be the sun, right? And this must be water. This then therefore must be a boat, right? So they're also interested in understanding how the eye sees, and so that becomes extremely important for them. This one is Rouen Cathedral, which is a cathedral in France, in Rouen, France. And what Monet does is he just stands out in front of the cathedral and he paints it. This one's in the morning, this one's at noon, and then this one's in the evening. And so again, studying how light and shading change a work of art, change the kind of feeling of. But again, it's about immediacy, trying to capture it right immediately because the modern world is so quick. But that's not all Impressionism. Mary Cassatt is another Impressionism. Part of Impressionism is capturing kind of similar to realism, capturing more of the kind of common day-to-day events. And so in that sense, it carries over that realism. What it's going to lack, though, is it's not really going to have as much of that social commentary per se. It's going to just show us kind of a window into the world in which kind of the common everyday world. And then where we see with the sowers is kind of getting us to sympathize and say, oh, isn't this kind of terrible? What we see with Mary Cassatt is, just a child's bath. This is a mother and daughter having kind of this intimate moment of, bathing the little girl. And it's just about getting us to kind of see, hey, that's kind of a nice representation, a kind of a nice moment that they're capturing. Post-Impressionism, as we kind of take a look at another movement, right? So this is our third art movement that we're taking a look at. Post-Impressionism is a rebellion against Impressionism. Once Impressionism, it starts out as rebellious and it says, oh, we're tearing down the salons, we're kind of doing our own thing. And generally what happens within the art world is once something does that, it then generally tends to become or often becomes popular. And then once it becomes popular, then it then becomes no longer fashionable for the up and coming artists to do that. So they want to do something else, right? And so it's kind of the similar idea. Most post-impressionists were once impressionists, and then they said, "Well, I feel too limited by impressionism," and so they then do their own thing. And so, post-impressionism is a little bit, it's more of a grab bag phrase. I mean, it's not though post-impressionists were kind of all collectively working together like impressionists. They were kind of all doing their own thing, and so all their art is going to look a little bit different. But this will include the works of Cezanne, Seurat, Van Gogh, Gauguin. These are all considered post-impressionists, all once impressionists, and then moved to post-impressionism. Um, but mainly, what they're focusing on is they believe that impressionism was too strictly following visual reality. And so what they're seeking to do is to find new methods of artistic expression, right? So their works tend to be much more expressive and less reliant on the visual world to emphasize more artistic insights. And so where we see this is kind of still kind of has that residual element of visual reality. What we see here is they're trying to focus more on expressive reality, as we've talked about Van Gogh before, and we've examined this one, Starry Night, with the cypress tree in the foreground and then the church and the village in the background, trying to capture his impressions, his imagination of, or his recollections, his memories, his feelings of this particular place that he's kind of looking down on, and then the moon, and then the planet Venus here, and then other elements within the sky. It's kind of interesting. Van Gogh, just kind of as a side note, Van Gogh believed that he saw more colors at night than he did during the day. And to me, that I have no idea what that means because I see a lot more colors during the day than I do at night. But I'm not an artist, and so it's kind of interesting kind of insights into how artists see the world and perhaps see it differently. He saw that light had a certain energy to it, and so this is why he kind of depicts it in certain kind of circles. It has a certain kind of vibration. If you look at closely at light at night, you can kind of see this kind of sense, this kind of energy that it has. So it's kind of interesting that it represents that. Cezanne is another post-impressionist doing something, almost completely different than what Van Gogh is doing. What Cezanne is doing in his rebellion against visual reality is he's flattening the canvas. As we see here, what he does is he reflects. Generally, what Cezanne does is he uses the foreground, colors in the foreground and colors in the background, and he uses the same colors. And so generally his colors, his paintings are going to have very few colors within them, right? Only, maybe a handful. Here we see green, we see some yellow, we see some brown, we see some dark kind of gray here, we see some kind of bluish, kind of a slate color here, we see black, but that's pretty much it, right? So it doesn't use like the wide spectrum of colors. And the effect of this, the reason why he did this, is it has the effect of flattening the canvas, where when you see these colors kind of reflected in one another, that gives the sense that we don't really have that sense of space of how far the trees in the background are from the trees in the foreground, or how far the mountain is from this kind of space here in the middle ground. And so it gives the sense of flattening the canvas. And so he's really here, what he's doing is he's questioning Renaissance three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional canvas as he's starting to flatten the canvas. And we're going to see this is going to be extremely influential for every artist that follows, and Picasso in particular is going to love Cezanne, and he's going to try to reflect some of Cezanne's brilliance. But again, he's trying to remove the reliance on that strict reality, and he generally focuses on kind of timeless elements. So he paints a lot of fruit to kind of show still lifes, or he paints, a lot of landscapes to show, rather than immediacy of the moment that we see with Monet and his Impression Sunrise, where he's got to sketch it down really quickly before the lighting changes. This is more timeless, right? We don't see any sense of lighting. We don't really know where the lighting source is coming from. And so it's not necessarily about capturing the moment, it's about capturing more timeless elements. And so it's a different kind of emphasis what we see with Cezanne. Taking a look at symbolism. Symbolism is kind of interesting because it's an art movement that's doing what Freud is doing with psychology. They're suggesting rather than focusing on the exterior world, they're focusing on the interior world of the mind. So it's doing something similar to what we see with Van Gogh, but they're kind of taking it to that next level. And what they're suggesting in a similar way to Freud is that there are deep kind of anxieties that are hidden below the surface. And so, as we see within Munch's The Scream, this is not an exterior scream, right? This is an interior scream. And so we see the individual here, and this is not, this again is a movement away from visual reality because we see the elongated face and the jaw. It kind of looks like he's an alien or something. And then just kind of, it feels as though he doesn't necessarily have bones, right? So it's not necessarily a representation of the human anatomy because it's not about visual reality. It's about trying to express emotions. And so, and then we see this kind of conflict with we see the bridge right here and then the river flowing underneath it, and it gives us these kind of dark, contrasting, the blue kind of cold and black, kind of distant feelings here, and that's contrasted with the vibrance, the energy of the sky with the yellows and the oranges, which contrast with that, giving us kind of again adding to that anxiety of that Munch is trying to represent within the Scream. So you guys have all kind of seen the Scream, but what he's representing here is some of the changes within the modern world as people were moving from their agrarian world into industrialization. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about Russia. But as the world started to urbanize and move towards the cities, people were leaving their hometowns where they lived for generations to go to live amid strangers in the cities. And so you see some tremendous changes, people that were coming together that normally wouldn't have come together, different languages that are coming together, and all kind of emerging into the melting pots of now the urban cities, city centers. And what Munch is representing is the anxiety, the toll that causes. And he kind of makes an interesting argument. He says that you never feel so alone as when you're in a crowd of strangers. Right, and I mean, maybe I mean, he obviously didn't live through COVID-19, so maybe he was wrong by that. But in some ways, when we're in a group of people that we don't know, we feel a lot more self-conscious. We feel a lot more as though we are alone. And so he's representing that inner scream, right? The inner anxiety of the toll of feeling alone. Or this one is another symbolist right on the cactus man, right? So he's representing not necessarily a visual reality but he's representing aspects of it, right? So we recognize the eyes, we recognize the nose, we recognize the lips, and we recognize what appears to be like a flower box here, and then what appears to be needles coming out of the face, but we don't necessarily think of them in connection, right? We don't think of them in tandem. And so it gives us things that are partially real and partially unreal that produce kind of dreamlike, disturbing kind of images. So again, we're rejecting the outside reality and focusing more on the imagination, the inner mind of the artist. And so some people really like Ray Dawn. Some people are really creeped out by him. I don't know where you're on that spectrum, but kind of an interesting individual. Taking a look at Cubism. Cubism is mainly influenced by motion pictures. And we'll talk about this more later in the semester, the development of film with Thomas Edison and the Lumiere brothers. But what they're interested in is this idea of rather than trying to be limited by a flat two-dimensional surface, what we have with Picasso or Duchamp here. Duchamp, we talked about him before with Dadaism, but he started kind of his art within Cubism. What we see with Picasso and the Cubists is they're interested in trying to do more with a two-dimensional surface. And so what we see within Duchamp's here, the new descending the staircase, is the question, can you depict motion on a two-dimensional static surface? And so as we see with the development of film, where people are capturing, this idea of motion more than one moment in time, on a two-dimensional surface, which would be a screen or whatever it's being projected on, they're inspired by that. And they think, oh, that's actually kind of cool. I wonder if we could do something like that. And so that's why their art looks a little bit so different. And so we see kind of the head kind of moving down the stairs, and this is just kind of capturing that sense of motion. Or we see the legs kind of moving here to capture that sense of motion. And here's Braque. George Braque was another cubist with Picasso. Kind of, they were the founding figures of Cubism. What we generally see with Cubism, how I generally teach Cubism, is to think of it as you have a photograph on perhaps a piece of glass or a mirror, and you take that photograph that's been kind of transcribed onto the glass or mirror, and you drop it. and then you just try to piece back those shard fragments in any way, right? And so, so what we see within their works is going to be a little bit more jagged. It's going to feel a little bit more like shards of glass. And what they argue within that, right, as they're shattering the picture plane, as they're shattering reality, is that the modern world has become shattered. And so, what they're seeking to do with their art is they're seeking to shatter reality in order to find a way to reconstruct it, hoping to have this kind of different ideal. Maybe if we can shatter the world around us, because the world around us is pushing towards, this is 1910 here, pushing towards World War I. And a lot of artists could sense that. We talk about Thomas Hardy as a poet that sense that, right? A lot of people are seeing the buildup of arms and they're saying, hey, we're kind of leading, we're kind of going in the wrong direction. So they're trying to say, hey, maybe there's a different direction that we can go. And so shattering reality, another big part of Cubism is trying to see, in addition to shattering reality and trying to create motion, they're also trying to see if they can depict three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional canvas. So not just, just the front view of something. They're also trying to depict, see if they can get the side view of it, both side views, the back view of it simultaneously. And so, as you see an image of Picasso, and there's two eyes on one side of the face, look a little bit deeper because it's actually giving you the same image from a different perspective. And so that's the reason why we see two eyes on one side of the face. And so what we see here is a violin and a candlestick. Again, shattering reality. We see the violin here, right? And to kind of take a look at this, this would be the neck, and this would be the base of the violin. And is the candlestick here, and the base of the candlestick right here. So we see the violin and the candlestick. All right, and then the last movement I wanted to show you was Expressionism. Expressionism was an art movement that mainly began in Germany, where artists sought to focus more on spirituality of art to renew humankind, believing again that, right, that artists that were believing that we're kind of going in the wrong direction. So maybe we need to reintroduce ideas to try to guide and direct, reintroduce spirituality. So what they focused on is that art should be about individual expression. So they use expressive forms, unusual colors to emphasize the individual expression. And so the large blue horses, we don't see this in reality, but it's about more of the artistic expression rather than visual reality. And here we see in the background, right, what seems to be maybe a hill or extra large radiated tomatoes, whatever the case may be. It's not necessarily about creating that sense of space. It's about creating just kind of a mood or emotion. So something that we can get lost in, right, and just kind of feel. We just need to feel more. Kandinsky was part of this movement, and he focused more on feelings. And what he was interested in is rather than representing the visual world, he's representing the world of music. And so he's painting sounds. And so sounds don't have a kind of a visual reference point. And so he's just listening to music and painting the colors that he kind of sees or feels as he listens to it. And so there's no kind of representation of depth. There's no orthogonal lines that are pushing us towards this kind of illusion of depth here. There's no objects that are being represented. This is abstraction, right? This is just designed to get us to feel, to get us to think about the world around us, to try to reincorporate spirituality in a world that feels adrift, feels as though it's lost its way, and it's going to, the fears that we're heading in a direction that's going to be catastrophic. And so in a lot of ways, they're kind of predicting what's going to happen in 2 years. In 1914, you're going to have the outbreak of World War I.